Okay, good afternoon to all of you, especially if you're from Asia or Australasia. For those of you from Africa, from Europe and North America, a very good morning to all of you. All right. Welcome to the book launch webinar of Contesting Sovereignty, Power and Practice in Africa and Southeast Asia by my good colleague, Dr. Joel Ng of the Center for Multilateralism Studies in the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. From the title itself, this is a wonderful opportunity to talk about regionalism and international relations in the Global South. I would say that rare is the comparative study of two Global South regions trying to speak to international relations theory. And I believe we will hear more of this from our two distinguished discussants, Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, the Executive Deputy Chairman of the S. Rajaratnam School, and the former ASEAN Secretary General, and also the distinguished Professor Kong Yen Fong, the Vice Dean Research and Development of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Now, the Global South is often neglected in the way we understand IR theory, and this is unfortunately a legacy of the Western-centric nature, of the discipline of international relations. Yet the irony is always staring us in the face. 2/3 of humanity live and work, and during these unusual COVID times, suffer in the non-West. It is therefore, I think, most urgent that what a lot of theorists call, quote, rest of the world, unquote, be thoroughly studied in terms of comparative experiences and shared problems. Joel's book has done it, and I strongly urge you to pick up a copy, either as an e-book or physical copy to look it through in terms of how it addresses the comparative study of the Global South. On the second level, having read the proof version of this book, I think this work raises some cautionary flags, okay, for those of us who are in international relations academia, about any wishful thinking about the one-way street expectations of integration by diminishing or puncturing sovereign borders out of rational choices and sometimes pure goodwill. It is so easy to say that, the world of globalization, is everywhere, and everybody needs to follow a liberal trajectory when it comes to predicting how international relations is going to evolve. But Joel's book, interestingly, raises some red flags about saying that, look, everyone's going towards this EU-type model of regional integration. And of course, COVID-19 has put in an unexpected retardant into this process. Even the EU, I think, is suddenly rediscovering the value of reopening border controls rather than reopening border controls. So I think by looking at the African Union and ASEAN, Joel's book actually has done us a service by indicating that these two regional organizations actually have negotiated these difficult compromises. How far do you bring down your borders just because it appears that the logic of integration, especially in economics, social dimensions, and politics, appears to lead towards that? And then, when you have a crisis like the current pandemic, people resort to borders as a defensive mechanism. So on a third level, and I'll end my opening remarks with this third point, I think Joel's book is very interesting in bringing us back to the study of norms and norm-governed behavior in international conduct. Do norms matter? I think 101 books have been written with this generic question in mind. And if yes, norms do matter, how so? Or rather, what compromises, need to be made to make them bind states or engender voluntary compliance with these so-called hybridized norms? And Joel's construction of the idea of norm circles and how the circles have to be negotiated to admit even outsiders as insiders is fascinating. Because when you look at the Global South, it is not stuck in time. They are actually looking at Western practices and then trying to make sense of it for local purposes. Before I introduce Dr. Joel Ng, can I quickly also make the standard admin announcement for Zoom webinars? If you have any thoughts, comments, questions, you can type them out in advance in the Q&A channel, which is open, and I'll come to you during the Q&A later. All right, I will try my best to ensure that every question and comment raised gets aired and responded to by either the discussants or by Dr. Joel Ng himself. All right. Without further ado, allow me to introduce Dr. Joel Ng, who will have 10 minutes to talk about his book. Joel is a research fellow in the Center for Multilateralism Studies, which I head. His research covers regionalism, norms, and integration in the Global South, obviously focusing on ASEAN and African Union in particular. He's also someone who has been a practitioner in a way in the non-profit and private sectors, working on refugee issues and investor relations in his earlier professional lives. He's the author of this book, which we're going to talk about today, and he has a DPhil from the University of Oxford. All right, can I also remind in advance the two discussants, please keep to 10 minutes each so that we can preserve the maximum amount of time for Q&A for what promises to be a very interesting book. All right, over to you, Joel.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you so much for this very exciting opportunity to share my new book with you all. I have to, first of all, actually say thank you to RSIS for this opportunity because they've supported my work in so many ways over the last 10 years, and I'm very, very grateful. In fact, a special word of thanks to Ambassador Barry Desker, who actually set me on this journey of researching comparative regionalism about a decade ago. And this is actually, I guess you would say, all his fault. This is the culmination of the work he set me on. Secondly, I guess if there's ever been a time when I felt like I was standing on the shoulders of giants, it's now with my two esteemed discussants who are Professor Kong Yuan Fong and Ambassador Ong Keng Yong. They have both been inspirations and mentors for me through all these years. So I'm very, very grateful to have them here today. Okay, so let me get my slides up. And see if I can start. Okay, so this is the book launch for Contesting Sovereignty, my new book. Alan asked me to say a word about my book cover. It was something I designed myself. It is basically actually a précis of the factors of normative contestation in regional organizations on the cover itself. So I use the concept of norm circles, which are the groups that contest between for or against a different proposals. They use their control of the initiative in a regional organization, symbolized by the clock. They have to rely on, appeal to, or rebut or refute the use of shared norms or previously existing norms of the regional organization in order to introduce their new norms. That's represented by the book. And the ships are this contingent aspect of metis, this diplomatic skill, or sometimes using material power that allows them to sort of get the advantage in these contests. So that was the idea behind this image. So as Alan has already preempted some of the things I was going to say, this idea of normative contestation comes is a lot to do with my background as a practitioner in the Global South. I would like to think about where I was 15 years ago as a young researcher in Uganda, actually, at the time where there was a conflict. And at the time when I drew on the international relations literature, I was told, or I read that I should be, or we should be expecting the tip of a norm cascade, that liberal norms and values had started to become entrenched in the Global South, and that we were at the tipping point of what they called a norm cascade of this great liberalization of ideas. But what I saw in the Global South was actually quite different. It wasn't this picture at all. In fact, if there were any indications of a norm cascade, I couldn't see them. You know, this one particular book that was called The Power of Human Rights said that President Yoweri Museveni was a true Democrat and the president of Uganda. And I saw him basically as a standard autocrat. So if this was what they counted as evidence of a norm cascade of liberal norms, I was very unconvinced. Perhaps the best example of this was the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi ranting at the African leaders who stated that they were clinging to old-fashioned sovereignties of anthems and flags that should now be consigned to museums. Now, if he had a problem with being unable to promote or pursue his form of regional integration, then what hope did sort of liberal foreign norms have at this time? But I found that regional organizations, or the contestation of that played out were exemplified in the regional organizations of these two regions. Now, the basic idea is that states are sovereign, but by joining a regional organization, they need to surrender some of that sovereignty, usually to pursue other goals such as economic growth, trade liberalization, and so on, but also sometimes giving up some of their ability to make sovereign decisions in terms of foreign policy and so on. So contests are inevitable in a regional organization, and they may have to give up some things in order to gain other things. And the question then is, how are these resolved? How do they decide when or what, under what conditions do they give up this sovereignty? Now, in the European literature, there was this idea of pooling sovereignty, that they eventually give it up in order to gain a greater sovereignty control, perhaps. But this didn't seem to me to explain what was going on in the Global South. Instead, we had a lot of debates about this notion of sovereignty. They were most amplified during the charter writing periods of the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. This was roughly 1999 to about 2012 in the case of ASEAN, which started a bit later and it therefore ended later, and greatly impacted or shaped the normative landscape of these two regions. So I looked at case studies that or cases of normative proposals in these two regional organizations that tested sovereignty. It would produce new norms that would question traditional conceptions of sovereignty or sovereign powers of the member states, but always with almost always with the view to trying to improve integration, deepening or strengthening the relationship between their member states. And then I looked at what happens, or what were the factors that were decisive in whether the new proposal was accepted, rejected, or qualified. So the case studies in my book, there are 6. I look at the United States of Africa. This is the grand proposal to federalize the entire continent. I look at a rather smaller proposal, but one that had a very far-reaching impact on the continent, which was the Conference on Security, Stability, Development, and Cooperation in Africa. This was about taking collective responsibility, regional responsibility for security problems in member states in Africa. And then the Pan-African Parliament. This was an idea that could amount to either a continental legislature or something much less. It had already been proposed as early as 1991, but when the moment came to institutionalize it in the formation of the African Union, it was qualified. I'll go into that later on. And then in ASEAN, I looked at human rights in the ASEAN Charter. The first round where it gets included into the Charter, even when there was debate about whether or not to put it in, and then the human rights mechanism debate that actually followed after the Charter was accepted because there were unresolved questions. And then turning outside of human rights, I look at the ASEAN-X formula as well, about this ASEAN decision-making process, which the Eminent Persons Group in 2008 had suggested as a way of improving the decision-making processes of ASEAN to allow for potentially majoritarian votes, or the -X or the 2+X, and various alternative arrangements. But this would bypass or overrule consensus, and also therefore the sovereign interests of certain members. I argue that it was rejected, as in it was confined to the economic community and required consensus to be accepted. Okay, so basically I use the same structure throughout my book of following each case through the life cycle of a proposal, right? So a proposal in diplomatic terms is raised to create a new mechanism or institution, but has strong normative implications, and these norms are therefore either opposed or supported by different actors within the regional organization. And then I look at them not only in terms of the weighing up who supports or opposes it. I tend to look at the cases where they are quite close outcomes. That means where the numbers are evenly matched, perhaps. In the regional organizations of African Union and ASEAN, where consensus is preferred, this tends to also lead to a lot of contestation, because they must convince those who would oppose it not to object, because even a single opponent can kill the proposal. Then I study or analyze the contestation in terms of three factors. One is the control of the initiative. That means how do they manage the whole process? Are they in control of the timelines, the outcomes and processes, or do they lose control to their opponents? How do they use shared norms? So aside from this existing norms that they already agree to, the new proposal tends to shake things up a little bit. Will either produce new implications or actually contradict some of the existing norms. So how do they use the existing ones in favor of their arguments? And then metis, which is a bit of a technical Greek term, but it's the idea of looking at diplomatic skill, and how do they find contingent, opportunistic events that might be able to shape outcomes, whether in terms of the events that unfold, or whether they have new ways of influencing other members of opposing norm circles. Okay, so let me finally explain how this works through an example of a case study. So I picked, as I mentioned earlier, the Pan-African Parliament. Now this was proposed, or actually before the whole contest period in 1991. But in 1999, Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan leader, unveils his plan to create the United States of Africa. And he was originally thinking of an African Congress, but when he realized that the Pan-African Parliament idea had already been agreed upon, he seized on that and said, let's form the African Union and Pan-African Parliament. Now, you notice that those are two different objectives. That means they were supposed to be two different institutions sitting in parity with each other. That means a legislature and an executive, actually. But in fact, what happened was not like that at all. What happened instead was that the Pan-African Parliament, which would have gone far too much in the federal direction for the other African leaders, was diluted instead into an advisory body, and this with no legislative powers whatsoever. And so this structure creates a lot of contradictions in its form, because what happens is that the liberal member states, if you think of them as Nigeria and South Africa particularly, that were newly democratic, keen to propose liberal norms for the African Union, ended up being the ones who were opposed to this Pan-African Parliament. Right now, this turnabout is most perplexing for Nigeria, in the case of Nigeria, especially since it was the one who came up with the idea of the Pan-African Parliament itself. Okay, but because the case is put in contrast or in the context of Gaddafi's United States idea, that they were opposed to, then they can't really accept it. So what happens? They created a Pan-African Parliament that was already decided right from the outset. So they couldn't do much about the idea that this institution was going to be formed. And while they used the idea of African Union for the people and by the people and of the people and so on as a stalling tactic against Gaddafi, which was so that they would not have to make the decision at CERT immediately. This meant that the Pan-African Parliament would have been one of the most important institutions to be created. But as they went about drafting the protocol for the Pan-African Parliament and so on, they essentially diluted its powers, kept it out of sight of Gaddafi, and then in 2000 in Lomé, when they agreed on the Constitutive Act, they agreed that supranationality had to be off the table for particularly this institution if the Constitutive Act was to be signed. So because there was no other choice, they had made a commitment to sign this agreement by 2000. 2000 had arrived, and if they stalled now, they would not get the African Union formed. They had to park the Pan-African Parliament. It would take another 2 more years before it would eventually come up with its full protocol, and by then it did not have the legislative powers that were sought. Okay, so this, of course, was a blow, I guess, to the integrationists, and basically they lost the support of the most fervent integrationists on the continent, Nigeria and South Africa. Okay, so this one case study, sorry, I do not have the time to go further, gives an illustration of how I used or how I talk about my case studies in the book. Okay, so I used utility as this idea of trying to fathom the interests of the member states. And the reason for doing this is to really bring in a foreign policy analysis approach, rather than the more sort of theoretically elegant but often wrong ideational or rational choice logics that are favored in international relations. Those would have been fine at some sort of grand theory level, but if you were trying to explain the particular outcomes in these two organizations, they were really, really bad predictors of which stance a state would take. There were so many historical dependencies, path dependencies rather, that created preferences that would not be explicable in these terms. Secondly, these utilities derived from direct experience. So this idea was that the abstract foreign kind of norms that were often presented or proposed in these regional organizations tended to fare pretty badly. What instead worked really well was things that had already been tried, or at least tried to some basic degree within the regions, and that they could understand and they could comprehend and see how it worked. So these hypotheticals tended not to be favored by the norm circles in question. Now, as I mentioned already, the power in practice plays out in 2 ways. Of course, the norm circles, first of all, tended to be the most distinctive indicator of whether a norm would be successful or not. That means if there was overwhelming support for it, there wasn't really much contestation. But where there was relative equality in terms of the balance of for and against, then this relational power between the 2 sides, which is marked out by diplomatic practices, tended to play a greater role. So again, this control of the initiative can be thought of in terms of a procedural competence, right? The practices of diplomacy and how well you are attuned to the domain, the rules of the domain, and how well you can get your way in terms of using the rules to your advantage. The mastery of shared norms. Again, this is a competence, an understanding about how or what your fellow diplomats believe and value, right? If you did not know this and you tended to appeal to some sort of universal values or something like that, then you tended to do quite badly. Whereas those who were very familiar and attuned to the values of their circles tended to be much better at arguing or making their cases. And then finally, a creative competence, metis, which is the hardest to quantify, and it's the hardest to really have a consistent measure around. In some cases, it was actually material. You could have Muammar Gaddafi literally paying the membership dues of states so that they would support his idea. And then in other cases, like in ASEAN, you had things like spa diplomacy, which were much more well, kind of material, but much less certain of whether there were any kind of influence would be transmitted. Okay, so this confluence of competencies means that diplomats and diplomatic practices are extremely important. So what are the policy implications of this? Now, I believe that the cases show how diplomatic practices are important in generating normative outcomes. These tend to be overlooked because diplomats don't actually like to talk about what they did, but about the outcomes they achieved. Diplomats actually need to be skilled in these particular areas, I believe, in order to secure the outcomes. But if they don't talk about it much, people don't realize how important they were in that process. Then secondly, there's this idea that contestation, or the form of contestation that takes place, can also be double-edged. Now, just because you got the result you wanted doesn't necessarily mean that that this result is firm or assured. Now, I found in the cases that I studied that the application of shared norms, that means the appeal to shared norms, if they were the sort of decisive factor, they created very strong, durable decisions. Whereas those that use sort of procedural actions or metis, the creativity to get that the result they wanted, may not actually have strengthened the legitimacy of the decision, right? That means the contestation continued further down along the road. That they may have accepted the decision, but they didn't want to. They didn't want to accept the further implications or the implementation of that decision later on, and so the contestation could re-emerge. Now, perhaps the best example of this is that both regional organizations use the idea that some of the decisions that they made were temporary to assuage the opponents or the opposition, but when it came time for review, and actually both institutions set 5-year review periods for a lot of these decisions, when it came time for review, nobody wanted to open it back up again. And this perhaps was the best demonstration that whichever side felt that the decision they had reached was a little bit on shaky grounds and were fearful to reopen those things. So the final thing is that the greatest payoff actually comes from repeated winning. That means if you need a decision to go your way, you need it to keep going your way. That means you need to persuade the others of the utility and the correctness of your decision, and expanding your norm circle to be larger is the most effective way to do that. So rather than trying to win a single battle, you need to win the war, to put it a different way. And this means you need to enlarge your norm circle, because that creates the most durable result. So I think in sum, this is a book about regionalism in the global south. And I hope I have done it justice in making it a perspective from and of the global south, rather than sort of looking at it through Western or European-centric lenses. I think it's important to note that foreign or external pressure plays much less of a role than some people would like, and in fact can often be counterproductive. And hard power also doesn't necessarily translate into soft power just because you put words on it. But the second thing that finally, or rather the final thing I would like to say, is that these indigenous processes of normative development are extremely important. They're still going on in the regional organizations, and we need to keep telling these stories and showing that this normative development is part of our own values, and we came up with them not just in reaction to something else, but because we believed in them or believed they were best for the region. And I think by studying this topic of normative contestation, we also get a better sense of where we are going as regional organizations go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joel. You went somewhat over time, but this is your show. Essentially.
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. Next, I'll bring on the discussants. First up, we have Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, Executive Deputy Chairman, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, NTU Singapore. Ambassador Ong, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you to Joel for having me on this launch of this wonderful book. And nice to see you, Dr. Kong. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to say that I read this book over 2 nights. And I was very intrigued by the approach which Dr. Joel adopted to bring across his thesis. Yeah, the idea of sovereignty among nations, different sovereign nations working together, is always very complicated. And if you plow through the first 2 chapters, I think the rest will become very clear to you. Yeah. The important thing, as Joel said, this is about regionalism and global south. I have not personally come across many publications of this nature to compare the African Union and ASEAN. So this is something really worth the time for those of us interested in ASEAN or ASEAN and African Union to take a quick look through the pages of the book. It's actually quite a thick book. Yeah, I don't like thick book. I like thinner book. But anyway, I want to say that it is a clever way of utilizing concepts like norm circles, yeah, control of initiative, what are the norms invoked, and how can we create opportunities from various things that are already out there. Perhaps I will spend the next few minutes first focus on the ASEAN part of the book, since I'm more familiar with ASEAN. There are a couple of things I want to say about ASEAN. In contrast to African Union, the approach of the ASEAN side is less institutional building. We tend to be leaving things to a more informal, flexible state. Once a particular critical mass is achieved, or when there have been some very, what I call epochal developments, like right now we have this thing called the COVID-19 pandemic, then the leadership in the ASEAN member states will sort of gravitate towards something significant in our own ASEAN institution building, or now we have the ASEAN community. So what do we do with the community? And how do we ensure that the community go forward? So in a certain sense, it's a different form of leaders, a certain control. We always say in ASEAN, leadership matter. But the important thing is that we go step by step. When we are not yet ready to launch a regional parliament, we try not to invest too much time on it. We deal with the practical day-to-day issue. Yeah, and as you all know, Southeast Asia is in the zone of the most extreme in climate, and natural disaster is a daily occurrence. So that's one thing quite different from the African colleagues. The second thing that we do is that we utilize economic development, for example, opening up our markets, doing more about the respective trading relationship to try to do what we call first thing first, early harvest, get the low-hanging fruits, so that as we go along to become more ambitious in certain things we want to do, which will actually affect the sovereignty notion of our respective nation in Southeast Asia, we get a bit less of the resistance. So the idea here is very Southeast Asian. Show me what you can do first, then we go to the next step. Yeah. And another point that we have to bear in mind is that overall, the ASEAN family or ASEAN community building is actually a response to what we saw in the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 1960s and 1970s. Yeah, there were many things happening around the world. Cold War in Southeast Asia with the Vietnam War, and we have the advance, so-called advance of the communism. So a smaller group of countries in Southeast Asia banded together, later more joined the regional grouping. So security, the future of our respective countries is actually a major driving force. Some other countries in other parts of the world, it's not a question of whether a particular country survives or not. Yeah, I mean, you take the example of Egypt or Ethiopia, where the AU is today located. Ethiopia, it is in some warring conflict with some other group of people within its own country and neighbors as well. But it is not a question of whether Ethiopia will be there further down the road. Whereas in Southeast Asia, some of our nations, where we are now in Singapore, there is always this worry that can Singapore survive another decade, or what will happen 50 years from now? Where is Singapore? So these are the kind of security-related, future-oriented kind of issues that come into play as we talk about the various themes of Dr. Joel's book. Okay, now we have it. So we look at your book and try to learn something out of it. One additional point that I think we should be aware of is this issue of making decisions based on consensus. Very often, ASEAN is touted as unable to do anything because the seeking of the consensus is impossible. Actually, personally, as someone who had been the Secretary General of ASEAN, I dislike the idea that ASEAN is always singled out to be the one regional organization facing such kind of problem. No consensus on major decision, like for example, the current situation in Myanmar, where the military had taken over and the civilian government elected could no longer be in control. It is not unique to ASEAN. Every international organization, every regional body also have consensus-seeking decision-making processes. So it's not quite fair, in my opinion, to always harp on this point and look at the negative aspect of the situation rather than striving to look at the positive opportunity, yeah, to get things going. The last point I want to make really is that in the ASEAN setting, there is a lot of equality that you don't get in other regional or international organizations. For example, the AU. ASEAN member states each pay the same amount of money into our ASEAN budget. Yeah, because we cannot divide or apportion the benefits from the organization. So you are a member of ASEAN, 1 out of 10, you pay 1/10 of the share of the budget involved in running the secretariat and some of our established activities. Secondly, this idea of diversity, yeah, coming together and coexist is very real. Yeah, we don't try to integrate or assimilate everybody into a particular setting and say, only if you do this, like for example, achieving human right accreditation, then you are part of ASEAN. No, we try not to do that. Every one of us is equal. Every one of us is diverse, and we try to find a common space and coexist as we go along. So I will stop here Joel, and look forward to audience giving us their comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ong. A lot of food for thought there from the ASEAN front. Next, I invite Professor Kong Yan Fung, Vice Dean, Research and Development, and Lee Ka-shing, Professor in Political Science at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, to give his take on Joel's book. Yan Fung, all yours.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's a delight to be here, and I feel honored, and it's a great pleasure. And for those of you who know me, it's also a great pleasure to be back in an RSIS event with which I had a very long and happy association under both former Dean Ambassador Barry Desker, and now under Ambassador Ong Keng Yong. So now, given the marvelous introduction to Joel's book by Alan, and then Joel's summary of the gist of his work, and then Ambassador Ong's very trenchant remarks focusing on ASEAN, I thought I should begin maybe by saying something about the biography of the writer, and sort of share some biographic snippets that you won't find in the book. Hopefully I can do that without embarrassing Joel too much. I first met the author of the book in 2013. In October that year, Joel enrolled as a doctoral student in Oxford's Department of Politics and International Relations, where I was teaching, and where I also happened to be the Director of Graduate Studies for International Relations. Now, on the Oxford side, what we found especially interesting about Joel was his PhD thesis proposal. It was one of the most thoughtful and rigorous we have encountered in years. And we normally do not get proposals that are so elegantly and well spelled out. So Joel was a must admit to the program. Now, of course, Joel wasn't just admitted. He was also awarded a Swire Scholarship offered by the Swire Charitable Trust, the owners of Cathay Pacific, and the scholarship was tenable at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. And that covered his tuition and living expenses for 3 years at Oxford. The Swire Scholarship, incidentally, is usually reserved for students from China, Hong Kong, and Japan. But the committee made an exception for Joel because, according to one of the people who interviewed him, "I've never seen a Singaporean like you," unquote. So what kind of a Singaporean was Joel that so impressed his Swire interviewer? Right. Joel, I would say, did not fit the profile of the typical Oxford PhD student. Between his bachelor's and his master's degree, there was an interregnum of 8 years, during which he worked as a relief teacher, a video editor, a communications officer for the Refugee Law Project in Uganda, and a public relations officer. Now, this, I suspect, was what prompted his interviewer to see Joel as unusual, someone with meaningful, rich, and varied experiences, and someone who could bring this background to bear in the Oxford environment, both inside and outside of the classroom, and of course, to his PhD thesis work. That's why these biographical details matter. It is this that I think informs the way he approached his topic, having the guts to compare, Africa with Southeast Asia. But then it's not an all rah-rah-rah story in the way that I've told you, because if Joel's background and experiences helped him clinch a full scholarship to study at Oxford, he was less lucky upon enrolling in the department. The academic he hoped to work with, Professor Jennifer Welch, an expert on norms and humanitarian intervention, left Oxford for the European University Institute 1 term after Joel showed up. As Director of Graduate Studies, the task fell upon me to find a new supervisor for him. But having read his proposal and having written about ASEAN, I arrowed myself as his new supervisor, because either that or I would have to go begging some colleague to do the job. So for the next 2 years, Joel and I met regularly to discuss his coursework and his evolving dissertation. But in July 2015, I pulled a Jennifer Welsh on Joel. I left Oxford to join NUS. Poor Joel got stiffed by Oxford a second time. But I hope my blow was softened by my agreeing to continue supervising Joel's thesis despite my move to Singapore, because it was such an interesting thesis. At any rate, Joel was someone who was adept at working independently. And my main role, if I remember correctly, was to remind him, keep the argument simple, because he was dealing with a very complex set of concepts that seek to account for norm contestation outcomes across 2 continents. Joel persevered and received his PhD in July of 2018. To his enormous credit, he succeeded in revising the thesis within 2 years to become the book whose launch we are celebrating today. Okay, let me say a few words about the book now. So the book is about norm contestation in 2 regional organizations, ASEAN and the African Union. Now, for those of us intimidated by the title and maybe the publisher, perhaps I can give a 1-minute guide, sort of like cliff notes to what the book is about, just based on the title. It is about how regional organizations deal with norms that come their way, whether to reject, accept, or qualify them. Now, these 3 possible outcomes, accept, reject, or modify, to me, is the most brilliant part of the work, because there Joel managed to show variation in the outcomes, and with that, he really has something to explain when he brings us to his norm circles and things of that sort. So when regional organizations deal with these norms, it always raises issues about sovereignty. That's why sovereignty is so present in the title, right? And they contest the degree to which you can protect your sovereignty, those norms, and whether you engage or dismiss them, those norms, says Joel, will depend on the group having the power to deal with them, the norm circles, and the way they go about doing it, their practice. And the book uses these concepts to tell us the story of how the African Union and ASEAN have gone about dealing with the norms, that they are confronted with. So there you have it, my 1-minute take on the book, inferring just from the title. All right, let me go a little bit into some of the concepts now. Studying norm contestation actually is a very challenging task. Identifying the supporters and detractors of a given norm would have required a very granular level of research that will stop most people. Studying how such norms are accepted or rejected or organizations like ASEAN and the EU, which are much less transparent than, say, the European Union, is something even more formidable. And it's only meant for the brave-hearted. But Joel could not be deterred, and his perseverance and theoretical as well as methodological ingenuity, I think, paid off. In my view, the book makes 3 distinctive contributions to the IR literature. First, as Ambassador Ong also identified, the use of norm circles. I think that concept pinpoints the actors involved in this norm contestation issue. Second, Joel's analysis of how these norm circles work, whether in controlling the initiative or in using other existing norms and practices, right? And finally, there are what he calls myths, or ability to opportunistically reconfigure preferences. And last but not least, the most impressive part to me, the sussing out of this account of how norms and sovereignty are contested and worked through by doing a systematic comparison of 6 fascinating cases, 3 from the African Union and 3 from ASEAN. This comparative research design I believe, is what allowed him to tease out the impact of how his causal factors led to the different observed outcomes in each of his cases. The story is still a bit more complex than my simple-minded approach to IR might hanker for, but Joel has succeeded in connecting sovereignty, norms, the AU, and ASEAN to give us a very fresh and novel understanding of the nature of norm contestation and the dynamics and its dynamics in organizations of the global South. To me, this is an impressive achievement, and Cambridge University Press seems to agree. What more can I say? I'll stop on that note. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kong, for that very magnanimous set of comments, as well as very rich food for thought about norms and contestation of sovereignty, etc. Now, there's a lot that's been raised by the discussants. So let me get to the questions. But actually, before I get to the questions, can I ask the author if he would like to say anything at this point?
Oh, thank you, Professor Kong, Ambassador Ong. Those works are very, very encouraging. I'm a little bit blown away by how kind you've been in the remarks. I like to take up Ambassador Ong's point about ASEAN not being, shouldn't be singled out about consensus decision making. I agree with him. In fact, I think it was very important not to relinquish that. And you know, when I was studying African Union, I asked several delegates. On paper, they have a majority vote allowed, a 3/4 majority. But I asked them how many times that had they ever used it. And then during the time of my research, the answer was actually none. They have never used that. And then the second time, as my book went to press, they had used it once, which was the admission of Morocco back into the African Union. And the main reason for that was quite one-off circumstance, which was that Western Sahara, which was a member of the African Union, would have obviously vetoed if they went for consensus. So it's quite an important principle for both regions in terms of maintaining the unity of the group. And I think, yes, it does obviously come with some trade-offs, but the greater whole remains much better protected as a result of its use. So thanks, and I'll stop there and wait for more questions.
Okay, Joel, now first up, let me take up Greg Mills' question, which is quite detailed here. He thinks that there is a slightly more problematic scenario when it comes to Africa and borders. So he would like you to address, I suspect he may have signed off, but nonetheless, I think it's for the edification of everyone who's still in this webinar. He asked if you would like to consider the prospect that African leaders tend to be stickier about borders compared to ASEAN leaderships because of the nature of the decolonizing experience. According to Greg Mills' description here, he thinks that Africa is simply not prepared for integration because of the colonial hangover over borders. Borders are used in his words as arbitrage, meaning I can trade borders with you, but I still will need borders at some point because our governance at home is weak. Therefore, we cannot go as fast as ASEAN. Well, my view is that it's a matter of degree. We are still very sticky in ASEAN about borders. Let me throw this out and also at the same time roll it into Benjamin Ho's question. I wish Benjamin Ho could provide more granular detail to what he asked in terms of the biggest similarity and differences in your comparison between the AU and ASEAN. I suppose if you answer Greg Mills' question, you will also overlap with what Benjamin Ho is asking. All right, so let me throw this out at you first before I summarize the other questions.
Okay, so let me talk about borders first of all. I am by no means as familiar with the African Union as I am with ASEAN, but I've tried my best. I feel that they have a fairly there's a lot of contradictions on the continent about borders and the continent, because on the one hand you have this grand narrative of Pan-Africanism, right? That Africa shouldn't have borders, that we are all African, and if it weren't for colonialism splitting us all up, we would have been far more united, and therefore also much more significant and powerful. In fact, that was Gaddafi's argument. But on the other hand, they have also clung to these colonial constructs quite fervently, and sometimes not necessarily rationally. If you think about in terms of how many nations or ethnic groups that got split along these borders as a result of the colonial divisions. So I'm not too sure why exactly you have this contradiction and how they manage it on a case-by-case basis. It's a bit of a big question to ask a regionalist, because each country has their own particularities about that. But I do think, generally speaking, that there has been this idea that the borders allow a form of control, like for example, customs or taxation across borders and so on, that are not very simple to give up, right? So if your main source of hard currency for the government, which doesn't have the capacity to collect taxes the ordinary way, is through collecting it at the borders, then it's going to be quite a big loss to enact free trade, right? But I do think that they are getting a lot better at this in terms of the domestic governance and so on. So perhaps there will be less resistance in the future on this. I also do think that the federal argument is very powerful, and we shouldn't underestimate it. So the East African community, for example, has an East African passport, which allows complete regional free trade, free movement within among the members of the East African community. The Southern African Development Cooperation has the same similar structure as well. So there are, and finally, the African Union has Agenda 2063, which is Gaddafi's vision, still there. It hasn't completely died, but it's just been postponed to a far future date. So they do want to get there, but the question is how in the meantime. Now, Ben's question about what are the greatest, thank you, Ben, for asking that question, because that was my spare slide. May I share my screen again? Okay, so I don't want to directly compare these two, because they're actually very similar, very different types of organizations. African Union is much larger, which brings a lot of other additional complications. But I did try to take a look at how they were distinct and how they were similar, right? And what was interesting was that their sovereignty norms, of course, originate from post-coloniality, right? Their independence, and both were very wary of ceding it, right? So the original stance with respect to ASEAN and the African or Organization of African Unity is, let's not give this up so carefully. The Organization of African Unity actually had a grand debate about this right at the very onset. In fact, the OAU is formed because of a victory of the sovereigntists over the federalists. And in 1963, the federalists wanted to unite Africa, and they were rejected. The shared factors. What was interesting was that the control of the initiative, shared norms, MITIS, etc., were shared or were obviously visible in the context of both groupings. I was not actually expecting necessarily that they would be quite so dominant, but as I looked and found them, it was clear that they affected the outcomes quite clearly. And the organizational norms were very powerful, right? So I remember when I was in the African Union doing my research, the secretariat officials told me that, you know, the African Union Secretariat is extremely powerful because we're the institutional memory. We remember everything. And this really was the clue that triggered, oh my goodness, the shared norms. They know all the shared norms. So that's why they're able to wield them in certain ways and frame arguments in certain ways and so forth. And this is, having had this insight, I then, when I looked at ASEAN, I said, wow, the ASEAN Secretariat has some of the same capabilities as well. Although, of course, it's a much smaller secretariat. And then in terms of metis, in terms of the opportunistic attitudes, if there is a particular leader or face of a particular proposal, then targeting that actor could be quite effective in terms of, if you can convince that person, everyone follows or will fall in line. So that was shared. But on the other hand, there were quite a lot of differences, and I don't have time to go into all of these. But if you read the book, you'll see that the different ways in which they played out certain things, such as the control of the initiative or which norms were particularly important to them, and so on, are quite distinctive. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Joel. Let me switch the Q&A now to two theoretical questions. Let me roll in the questions by Frederick Klim together with Mr. Salil Sen. Now, Frederick asks what role identity plays in the context of regional norm acceptance. Again, for the interest of a richer discussion, can I request that Joel hold his fire for the moment, and I invite Ambassador Ong to weigh in on this from his practitioner's perspective, and then I'll come to Professor Kong as well. Ambassador Ong, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Alan Chong. I wanted to just quickly add 2 points to what has been shared so far, particularly with reference to Greg Mills' query about the borders and experiences in Africa. One of the things that is really very understudied in ASEAN is our decision in ASEAN to rely on the English language as the common form of communication and links among all of us. So, I don't know, Professor Kong is someone who knows the British system more than I do, but in my duty as Secretary General of ASEAN from 2003 to 2007, I found that very often the spoken English language and the written English language actually help to bring the different diverse ideas and argument into a more coherent manner, which all of us can actually plunge in and try to convince each other. Yes, in the case of African Union, in the case of UN and elsewhere, they have wonderful, wonderful interpretation, instantaneous translation, this and that. But when you have to operate with one language together in a room, yeah, it's much easier. Yeah. So this is something that I feel is not well thought of. If Joel has the courage to write a second volume of his book, maybe we can focus on the linguistic and the more distinct cultural aspects of the two regional organizations. The second point I wanted to make is that overall, the norms as we know it may not be as well developed in some of our countries, whether in Southeast Asia or in Africa, because in contrast to the more developed countries in the Western civilization, which happen to populate many characteristics and ideas into the global order today, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, we try to find a way to link our traditional sense of interaction or sense of justice or sense of fair play into the whole scenario. So this again, Joel, if you are brave enough, in your second book, you can talk about linguistic and traditions, which help to formulate many of the distinct form of operating that we see in ASEAN and Southeast Asia. Your reference to the spa diplomacy, in the old days, it's called a golf diplomacy. Play golf. Now, younger people don't play golf anymore because it's not a popular game. Now people go to the spa and hang around in the steam room to try to convince each other which norm we should all support or reject. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Kong, any insights on this question of identity?
I could just add on to what Ambassador Ong just mentioned about spa diplomacy and Joel's second book. It's interesting when Joel was listing the differences between ASEAN and Africa, he mentioned spa diplomacy. And I was a bit, pleasantly surprised by that. So these days they go to the spa instead of golf, right? Because back in the 1990s, we heard that when Vietnam was about to join ASEAN, they went around asking how they can be effective in ASEAN, right? And apparently the answer either from Singapore or somewhere said that, okay, to be effective, you got to be able to do three things. One, sing karaoke, all right? Not a very good thing these days, especially in Singapore, all right? Secondly, be able to eat durian, right? Not very good for the Vietnamese northerners because they are not so used to durians. And thirdly, golf. All right, as Ambassador Ong mentioned. So looks like it might have changed, but then that still suggests that there are elements of Southeast Asian identity that may allow members of ASEAN to coalesce together. I'm a bit surprised though, Joel, that in Africa they don't have the equivalents. You say that they are more impersonal. That that was new to me.
Yeah, the impersonality is probably just a function of size with 55 member states. I think with the regional groupings like ECOWAS or SADC, I think it's much closer. But I think in the big, broad African Union, it tends to be overwhelmed by just sheer numbers.
Okay, Joel, Mr. Salil Sen brought up this phrase in his comment here, which you can see on the screen. He thinks your book has reconfigured the ASEAN and African Union narrative with the intent of what he says, dignity through sovereignty. So, this, I suppose, falls into what Ambassador Ong was saying earlier about your potential second book, where you deal with the discursive dimensions of how norms are produced. Right.
Well,
okay. Would you like to comment on this, or I'll go on?
Well, I should point out about the language question. African Union has, I think, 4 or 5 official languages: Arabic, French, English, Portuguese, and Kiswahili, I think. And it was a big challenge to. I could read the French and English. I had to find help for the Arabic and the Portuguese. Luckily, nobody really printed much things in Swahili. But in any case, this idea of giving them a little bit of dignity back is quite correct, because if everything is always held in the light of a European lens, it's not as good as the European Union at this or that and whatever. Then it's always a one, a false comparison because they weren't trying to be the European Union, and 2, always falling short of some imagined standard that the Europeans allegedly have, which I do not buy at all. But I don't think interregionalism is necessarily going to be the furtherance of this project or the idea, because each of the regions have their own kind of very particular problems and they solve them in particular ways. So I mean, to the extent that yes, we should, I think it would be a good idea to have the regions interact more with each other and learn from each other. But I don't think that there might be some sort of large global South getting together or something like that. I think just looking at the the problems or the challenges that the BRICS have had in trying to form a sort of regional grouping that isn't geographically tied down is already demonstrative of how challenging that particular approach would be.
Okay, wonderful. Now, let me direct you to a second theoretical query by Frederick Klim. Perhaps I should also tag on Pascal Venesson's question as well. Frederick asks if any of the discussants or Joel himself would like to comment on how this idea of consensus is reached in agreeing to a norm. Ambassador Ong spent a lot of time talking about consensus from the practitioner's perspective, and Frederick seems to believe that at some point consensus is not just about wordplay, it's actually about giving monetary incentives. You want a consensus? I must have a buy-in. Give me something, and so on. Is this the case in both ASEAN and EU? And of course, Pascal asked this loaded question, how does your argument contribute to the norm cascade literature, which is a big one? All right, any takers, any one of
Okay.
you?
So consensus, yes. So securing consensus, actually in my book, I do discuss, it's quite a funny thing because in discussing the United States of Africa proposal, I bring in the idea of NEPAD, which was this new partnership for Africa's development, which was a funding mechanism for development projects that has become quite a major platform in the new African Union. And basically, the countries that were opposed to Gaddafi were also ones that were quite successful at raising money from the West. And what did they do to get one of Gaddafi's chief allies on board was to make him a founding member of NEPAD, which meant that Senegal, Abdoulaye Wade's the leader of that country, would become a founding member. And yes, he did get, therefore, first cut choice on sort of some of these development project monetary incentives, and therefore became rather less tied to this United States of Africa proposal. So yes, that's what I mean by metis. It's a bit hard to quantify or to predict in advance, but when you see some of these opportunities that come about, you can find that there are ways to sort of secure the preferences of these states. But as I warn also that these are temporary and they might not be lasting unless you really look at the foundation on norms, shared norms. Yes, I think about consensus, I think there is a sort of tipping point at which people stop trying to disagree. So if you can amass a large number, then people will firmly shut up. That was in the Conference on Security, Stability, Development and Cooperation in Africa, CSSDCA. That was how Obasanjo got it through the second time round. He had actually got vehement opposition the first time, but he put money and he put a deal with Gaddafi on the table. And then when Gaddafi was no longer opposed to it, nobody else seemed to want to oppose it, even though I think there were quite a few member states, especially the ones who were funding, military activities in their neighbors, who would not have preferred that outcome, who would just kept quiet about it thereafter. So there are a number of ways to secure that consensus. I find that the most useful one is, of course, to get the most support for the idea. So Pascal's question about the norm cascade. So the norm cascade, in my view, is possible when, as I say, when the numbers are overwhelming in support. But you have to demonstrate that that the numbers are indeed overwhelming in support of this idea, and then yes, the new norm can take root very quickly. But for the vast majority of debates in regional organizations, this is not the case. And I put in my very dense theoretical argument early on in the book that in regional organizations are conservative inherently, because it's very hard to win or to secure the outcome you want when the numbers are very even, because of the rules of the domain that make sure that it's very hard to press home the advantage in only one area when you don't have overwhelming support. So it's what I would say though is that the norm cascade literature had observed or had picked up the wrong signals perhaps, and what they saw, well, gladly for me, was contradicted by the sort of populist backlash in their own countries. But it also reaffirmed what I felt I was observing in the global South, that there was still a very rich diversity of normative preferences, and these had not, they were not converging on some sort of Western model at all. But it's possible as long as, you know, there are sufficient numbers.
Alan, can I come in here?
Yeah, sure. Professor Kong, yes, please
I
go ahead.
think on the question of norm cascade, it's also a question that I asked Joel when he was writing up the PhD thesis. All right, but I think in this answer that he was giving this afternoon, he's being very diplomatic or very nuanced, typical British trained kind of scholar, whereas I'm a little bit more crude. All right, I think if you were to use his terminology, you could say that there ain't no norm cascade. You know, I mean, there is some, all right, but that's not the only outcome possible, because you know, when norms get when these organizations confront norms, actually the first thing that happens is that they get entrapped into by the norm circles, to use one of you know, Joel's term, and then they get twisted and turns, you know, by the diplomatic practices, you know, that these organizations are capable of, and then depending on who has the metis, the outcome is hard to say. It could be acceptance, it could be rejection, it could be qualification. So cascade is just one of several possibilities. And that is the very nice contribution of the work, to show the variation in outcome.
Very much like the way the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific was produced. But okay, can I invite Ambassador Ong to say something about consensus practices within ASEAN?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the important thing is that there must be a lot of what I call homework. Given the nature of the various native-oriented positioning, yeah, and the idea that because ASEAN as a group does not give out incentive like what Frederick talks about, or what the Europeans are doing in terms of getting buy-in, yeah. So it is a traditional wayang kulit, Professor Kong and Joel. We maneuver in such a way that we show you a bit of my beautiful country, but you want me to support you, you have to do a bit more. But then we don't provide any financing for project or anything. So how do we do it? As I mentioned, playing golf is no longer in vogue. Spa also now no longer popular. Karaoke now is dangerous because of pandemic. Yeah. So actually, ASEAN programming has now become more and more stuck in what we call lack of consensus situation. Actually, there is a convenient excuse. There are many areas of convergence. It comes back to another important point about consensus seeking, Alan. That is that it's a timing. I think timing matters in every way. Reading Joel's book, I thought that the effort by the African leaders, effort by the ASEAN leaders, whether with regard to any specific project in Africa or initiative in ASEAN, timing is everything. Sometimes your idea is jolly good, but due to one reason or another, somebody else would not weigh in. So you get your norm circle stay intact, when actually the mood should be in favor of adjustment. Those who are opposing a particular norm may now move towards more accommodation. So at the end of the day, I think one of the most important consideration in seeking consensus in our regional organization like ASEAN or even in AU, you require a good sense of timing. Good sense of timing. When we say in ASEAN, leadership matters, a lot depends on how the respective promoter of the idea, using the Joel's point, how the prime mover in a particular norm circle organize his action or his diplomacy. Yeah. So in ASEAN, we have one great advantage because our chairmanship rotate every year. So even if you don't get your way, you just try to be patient because you only wait 11 months. After that, you may be the chairman or another new chairman will come and you execute your action. So the sense of timing is important. What some of the clever leaders in ASEAN have done in order to maintain a sense of momentum, they couldn't get what they want. They couldn't shift the norm circle to a point of a difference for their action or their required project. But what they do is that they put out our favorite term here called low-hanging fruits to sort of, because we can't use money, we can't finance any project. So we cleverly work on what we call external parties, external partner of ASEAN. Yeah, like for example, the best thing that happened to us was this idea of free trade agreement with some of the major trading partners of ASEAN. How to get buy-in from the other closed market in Southeast Asia. We suddenly see more people can export their onions into China, or more bananas into China, or more palm oil into India, and all that. Yeah, and that is how, at the end, the respective country concerned came to the consensus. Thank you. Okay,
thank you, Ambassador Ong. Fittingly, in the last 7 minutes of this session, we have a question directed precisely at Joel from Patrick Quinton Brown. Might you say a little more about the management of power inequality in your cases of contestation and its place in your model? Are conditions of parity or near parity necessary to ideal contestation? Why? I suspect this comes from a neo-realist direction. So again, I suspect you have to go back to the interplay between hard and soft power indices and things like that.
Thanks, Alan.
Up to you.
No, I know Patrick well. He's a good friend of mine, and I'm quite sure he's not a neo-realist. But I think he raises a very interesting point, and in fact, Ambassador Ong had also alluded to this in that earlier on, that ASEAN member states all pay equal contribution. So this actually neuters their the differences in material power at the decision-making level in ASEAN quite effectively. And this is not the case at all in the African Union case. Especially in the 1990s, the OAU had something called the Big Five, where five member states contributed over 50% of the OAU budget. This were Libya, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and I can't think of the last one right now. But anyway, but this gave them huge amounts of leverage in their respective organizations. So if one of them said they were going to do something, this was often the case that it would happen. In ASEAN, it's not quite so easy because of that parity in terms of the power. So you get cases where a small country can irritate a very big country just by obstructing something that the big country wants to do. This almost never happens, for example, in the African case. But there is something to be said about that, in that the complexion of ASEAN is therefore always a little bit more consensual, right? You do not get the small countries' rights trampled upon if they are opposed to something, but then they need the obstruction or obstacle that they're posing to the larger country needs other ways to get around it. That means you need to be more persuasive, and that persuasiveness might, in terms of some sort of material benefit and so on. And that's not to say that that you're buying them out, but really that you need to make sure that their interests are looked after in a better way. So I think that's actually quite an interesting final takeaway of this, is that power really matters in these regional organizations, and at the same time, the power parity is actually important for the good sort of living well with each other, with the friendly relations with your neighbors. And so I don't think we shouldn't go for more inequality in order power inequality in order to get more things done. At the same time, we should also be more aware of how that inequality plays out, and sometimes be more sensitive perhaps to the smaller states' needs.
Okay, well put. Would Ambassador Ong or Professor Kong like to weigh in the last 4 minutes? No?
Well,
Okay.
I would just say this is a very useful reference book, because in our ASEAN family dealings, we try to look at other examples of regional organization and their practices. Yeah. So this particular thesis has really make us feel not so lonely. Yeah. But more importantly, we should not be mistaken. Africa is a huge continent. Southeast Asia is also very huge, but mostly water. Yeah, Prof. Kong. Yeah. So what do we do with all the water? Maybe in the future, water will become the key resource of our humankind. But for now, yeah, ASEAN, we are just conscious of our little, what we call corner coffee shop status compared to the plantation that, or the huge big companies that Africa is all about. So there is still a lot to learn from Africa. And but I'm quite convinced that language and tradition play a big part. Yeah. However, we should open ASEAN to more interaction from Africa. Joel, hopefully your book can lead to more interaction between Southeast Asia and Africa. There's not enough context and not enough exploitation of the opportunity that we have. What was the word? Your METIs. There's a lot of creative opportunity between the big continent of Africa and us here in Southeast Asia, and we just have to plunge in and get something out of it. Over to you, Professor Kong.
Okay, just two very quick thoughts. First one is, when Joel first introduced the term norm circles back in Oxford, when I, became his supervisor, I really had problems with that term. I think we had endless debates probably about why this notion of norm circles, all right? You tell me about Surin Pitsuwan, you tell me about the Singapore delegation, just name me the individuals. Is this idea operational? All right, but when I hear the way Ambassador Ong and myself use the term norm circles this afternoon after we have read the book, seems to me that we have become, users of the term. That is one of Joel's contribution. He has introduced a terminology into, the acceptors and the resistors of norms within ASEAN. Wow. All right. And secondly, I think this is a really brave book. Anyone who dares to compare ASEAN, with the African Union, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, there are issues, but then someone has to do it. All right. And congratulations to Joel for being a trailblazer on this.
I will make a new T-shirt. I am in the norm circle for RSIS Day.
Now that's a thought to hold as we bring this to a wrap. Thank you, Joel, first of all, for producing this wonderful book and for triggering the process that led to this book launch. Thank you, Ambassador Ong, for your time and your insights. It's been, I think, enriching for everyone who's participated in this webinar. And of course, last but not least, Professor Kong, thank you for rejoining the RSIS family again, extended family, if only for this webinar. We look forward to having you as a discussant as well as potential paper presenters if you have anything in the pipeline for future events. Thank you all for attending this webinar, and I hope that you've been enriched in some way. Please continue to follow our channels when it comes to announcing future events, and there will be plenty more throughout this June, July, August period. Thank you. And I call this to a close by drawing attention to Joel's discount pamphlet. All right, it was circulated together with the advertising email for this webinar. In any case, you can contact either the organizers or you can contact me, and I'll be happy to send you a soft copy of this promotion leaflet. It's a 20% discount if you purchase directly through the Cambridge University Press website, and the promotion code is NG, the surname of the author, 2021. And the discount lasts right up to New Year's Eve, which is a long time. All right, it'll outlast the Singapore sale, the Great Singapore Sale as well. Okay, with that, I think I can draw this to a close. All outstanding questions, if any, okay, please direct by email to the author himself. All right, you can find his email on the RSIS website. Okay, good morning and good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.